starting.
Have you started?
Well, hello everyone. Welcome to another live stream on the HVI podcast. And today I'm joined by Dr. Nicholas Peter Lee Allen and Dr. Robert M. Price. And today we'll be talking about the unreliability of the New Testament. And also, we're also going to be talking about some of the academic bias, especially surrounding the way they handle dating the New Testament and trying to make these texts as early as possible without really good evidence for that position. So Nicholas and Bob, thank you both for joining me today.
Oh, what a pleasure. Yeah.
And
would you like me to start with the PowerPoint, or do you want to chat first?
Yeah, I would like you to start with the PowerPoint just real quick.
Okay.
I'll just let everybody know that this discussion is based on a lot of what I would be asking about today will be based on Nicholas's book, The Jesus Fallacy, and also Bob's book, The Amazing Colossal Apostle. The links to purchase those books in the description below and in the pinned comment. Okay, Nicholas.
Okay, I just need to share the screen. Or you need to let me share the screen?
It should let you right now.
Okay, I don't see the button. That's why I'm asking.
It looks like the TV icon in the bottom.
With the plus on it?
Yes, that's it.
Okay. Oh, there we go.
Yeah, that's it. I'll just wait for you to put the PowerPoint up to full screen.
You should be able to see a.
No, you hit stop. You hit stop.
I've stopped the screening. Yeah, that worked.
Yeah, try to do it again. When you want to hide that little icon saying this, you click on the three dots, not the stop button. You'll see what I'm talking about in a second. Okay, put your thing on full screen real quick. The PowerPoint.
For some reason, now it's not working. We'll just do it again. Okay, for some reason, it doesn't want to work now.
Try Alt Tab and see if it actually is going full screen, but it's not.
Alt Tab.
Yeah.
I don't know why this is doing this. Oh, there we go. Okay, you can see.
Click on those. You see those three dots right there next to stop sharing. Click on those three dots. The three dots to the right. To the right. No, right there.
Okay.
There you go. Continue.
So you should have a nice white screen with two books titles on it.
Yes, I see it.
Okay, so what we're discussing today is the whole issue of how the New Testament was most likely put together. And what is fascinating for certain scholars is what may have been borrowed from other authors that may have informed some of the information in the New Testament. And particularly what's interesting for me is that if you read Luke Acts, especially Acts, there's a lot of historical detail in there And many scholars will tell you that Luke is the quintessential, he's a fantastic historian. And the facts are that the history that you read in Acts, as an example, is there as a backdrop to make the didactic information, in other words, what they're trying to teach, what they're trying to convince you to believe in, is placed within a realistic background, a history, which we're assuming is correct. And that gives authority to what they're saying. But if you read Acts from our perspective, where we have more knowledge of what happened in the last 2,000 years, you realize that history is very faulty. And that tells you that perhaps the people who wrote or redacted these earlier texts may have had a little bit of knowledge, but certainly the people who read these texts, and certainly the communities who were probably largely illiterate, had no ways of judging the accuracy of that historical background that was put there purely as a rhetorical device to make the didactic information seem more believable. And so we like to look at things, for example, Homer, because a lot of these, the Acts especially, has a very Homeric ring to it, which possibly because the people who wrote it studied Greek, and they used Homer to teach it. And we also see clues that stuff may have been borrowed from people like Josephus and Suetonius, as an example. And so what I'm going to do here in, say, half an hour is just quickly go through some of these issues that we can then use as a point of departure and discuss. Now, two major books that Josephus wrote, everybody should know, Antiquitates Judaica and Bellum Judaicum, the Judean War. But today, I'm going to concentrate on Bellum Judaicum because that contains the Judean War information leading up to the destruction of the temple. If you look at the New Testament, there's a lot of stuff in there which seems to be reliant on Josephus. Now, we can't say it is reliant on Josephus, but there's so much of it that one wants to sort of say, well, where there's smoke, there may be fire. And perhaps much of this is wishful thinking. But if you go through all these connections, it is quite fascinating. So, for example, prophecies of the temple being destroyed, obviously that's quite easy to do if you write that text after the destruction of the temple and then simply retrospectively say somebody prophesied it. But the way it's written, not one stone will be left upon another, which you see in Mark. When you read the Judean War, there's an emphasis on the fact that the Romans were picking through the stones one after the other to look for treasure and things they may have missed. This is very interesting. Luke tells us that in the future, Jerusalem will be surrounded by armies and desolation has come near. That's very specific, because if you read War, book 5, the Romans do surround Jerusalem as an army with siege works, and desolation did come. False messiahs and prophets, well, the promise that in the future all these messiahs and false prophets will arise and mislead people, very interesting, because if you read Josephus, and his text is about 8 times bigger than the New Testament, if you look at all his writings, most of it he talks about, well, in Judean War, he talks about and he blames false prophets and false messiahs for causing the problem in the first place. The very reason why Judea was ultimately destroyed by the Romans. He blames on false prophets and on people who are misleading the people with fake religion. Wars and upheavals. In Mark, we're told about rumors of wars and nation against nation, etc. And the Judean War deals exactly with that. Factions fighting against factions, especially within Jerusalem. We have Sicarii, we have zealots, we have famine, especially, and we have physical violence against people who are trapped in Jerusalem by their own people. Mark talks about tribulation. If you read War 6, 201 to 213, there's a story there of a woman who is repeatedly raped, who ends up eating her own child. And it's to emphasize this unparalleled suffering due to famine, violence, and destruction. Abomination of desolation. Mark says, when you see the abomination of desolation set up where it ought not to be, well, everybody knows what happened with in war. We have the story of, I think this was Caligula, the Caesar's image is put up in the temple and sacrifices are offered, which is the ultimate abomination from a Jewish perspective. Mark talks about people will have to flee into the mountains. And on that issue, there is no direct Josephus mention of normal Judeans fleeing to the mountains, but there's tons of stuff about Sakari fleeing to the mountains.
Wow.
And if you go back to a mention of a 1st century BCE event, he talks about 6,000 people fleeing to the mountains. And in signs and omens, he says there'll be earthquakes, famines, pestilences, terrors, and great signs from heaven. Of course, this is wonderfully rhetoric stuff to make you feel that something really supernatural is going to happen. And Josephus says almost the same thing. He talks about a comet shaped like a sword. He mentions a cow giving birth to a lamb in the temple, which of course is very interesting because I know some Christian authors have seen that as a sign that God wants people to move from Judaism and the red heifer sacrifice to Christ, who is the Lamb of God. And there are all sorts of possible interpretations there. And again, he talks about supernatural voices from the heavens and people fighting in the clouds, chariots in the clouds, etc. So all these things link up. There's also interesting to look at historical parallels between Luke, Acts, and Paul and Josephus. Theudas, the messianic deceiver, if you read Acts, the very famous sage and grandson of Hillel the Great, Hillel the Elder, Gamaliel, is talking to the people and trying to stop them from executing nascent Christians. And he explains to them that in the past, there was a chap called Theudas who claimed to be somebody, and people rallied to him, and he was ultimately killed. Now, if you read Antiquities, we know that this Theudas existed in about 44 to 46 CE because Phaedrus was the procurator then, and he had him beheaded. I mean, he did have him killed, and he also was persuading people to follow him. So if this was the same Theudas, we have a little bit of a problem because Gamaliel, if you read the Talmud and you read all these various tractates from the Talmud, you get the impression that Gamaliel the first was living between about 25, maybe to 45, no later than 50 CE. But Acts has this man delivering a speech in the Sanhedrin just after Jesus has been crucified, which must have been about, let's say, 35 CE, roughly. And he's referring to Theudas in the past, who lived in 45 CE. And then he goes on to say, after that, that Judas, the Galilean, came on the scene. Now, Judas, we know he died soon after 6 or 7 CE, no later than 19 CE at a push. So we have a very interesting situation here. And I must say that if Acts got the timing right, got the chronology right, I wouldn't be suspicious. But it's because it got the chronology wrong that I'm suspicious, because it looks like they just borrowed this information and stuck it in wherever they thought it would be useful, forgetting that it's 40 years out. So another little side comment is that Paul himself claims to have been educated at the feet of Gamaliel. That's quite a claim. This was a major sage and teacher. As I say, he was the grandson of the great Hillel. Then we've just talked about Judas the Galilean. Specifically, Judas the Galilean appeared in the days of the census, which is 6 to 7 CE. And we know that he led a band of people in revolt. And in antiquities, we have the same information, Judas leading a revolt at the time of the census by Quirinius. My comment here is that there are close verbal parallels suggesting borrowing. Plus, we have this chronology issue again. Then we have the Egyptian false prophet. A Roman tribune mistakes Paul for the Egyptian who led 4,000 Sicarii into the wilderness. We don't really know why this is said. This is mentioned almost out of the blue, as though everybody knows about this. And then if you read Josephus, of course, we find the reference to it, a false prophet called the Egyptian. And when he lived, and also the procurator Felix killing 400 of his followers. Striking similarity of detail. Under events and movements, there's a lot of talk about a famine being prophesied. This prophet Agabus predicts a famine during the reign of Claudius. Well, that's very convenient because there was a famine during the reign of Claudius. But that means whoever wrote this prophecy had already experienced the famine under Claudius. If you look at Josephus here, he mentions that there's a severe famine during the reign of Claudius. And Queen Helena of Adiabene sends grain to Jerusalem to help the Judahites. So here we have evidence of strong thematic overlap. Again, maybe it's a coincidence, but I don't think so, because you can't prophesy something that hasn't happened yet. I don't personally believe in prophecy, no more than I believe in a flat earth. And then we have the expulsion of Jews from Rome. That's interesting because here I don't think personally that Josephus would be the source for that. This would have been a well-known event, and possibly there was no borrowing here. And if you look at Josephus, he does talk about Tiberius expelling Jews from Rome, but at an earlier period. And Suetonius mentions specifically Claudius expelling Jews from Rome. So there's a possibility that Suetonius may have been used here, a possibility. This is a very, very obvious borrowing here. Acts tells us that Herod Agrippa puts on his royal robes, enters the theater, sits upon his throne, and delivers a speech. And the speech is so amazing that the people shout out that he was a god and not a man. And then an angel strikes him down. He dies almost immediately with worms eating his stomach. And the explanation is that because he didn't give God the glory, he was filled with hubris. Interestingly, the same story is told in Antiquities with a little bit more detail, where Agrippa puts on silver garments which reflect the sun, and he looks like a god standing before the people, and they shout out that he is a god, not a man. And then an owl, which is a messenger of omens, appears. Not the angel is also a messenger, but this is an owl. And immediately severe pain arises in his belly, and he dies after 5 days. The resemblance is very strong here, and possibly too strong to just be a coincidence. Of lesser importance, Paul on trial before Felix and Festus. Interestingly, if you want to get information on Felix and Festus, you can get it all out of Josephus's writings. And some scholars think that Acts used Josephus's chronology to frame Paul's trials. So in other words, they're saying these things are made up. They're written purely for didactic reasons, to teach people. And they have to give it a nice historical backdrop, as I mentioned earlier. So what better than to go and borrow one from Josephus and then put your facts into that nice setting. If you look at historical parallels between Luke, Acts, Paul's, and Josephus. You've got claims made by the New Testament, and you've got claims made by Josephus. Both talk about the census under Quirinius, but in the New Testament, they want Jesus to be born in Bethlehem, and they have the story there of Herod hearing about the King of the Jews being born, and he wants to destroy all the firstborn in Jerusalem or Bethlehem, and he sends out soldiers who kill everybody. So the theological or didactic reasons are more important than history here. So we have a conflation of a birth happening in around 4 BCE being tied directly to a census that happened a good 10 years later. So that is very interesting in itself. Then you have the issue, which I've already mentioned, Theudas predates Judas the Galilean, Paul mistaken for the Egyptian, the death of Herod, the famine under Claudius, and Paul before Felix and Drusilla. And these names and relationships align very closely with Josephus's own narrative, which is also very interesting. We have Paul before Festus, Agrippa II, and Bernice. And there's a possible borrowing here from Josephus because of the personnel involved and the sequencing, which concur with Josephus's political framework. Again, Acts may rely on Josephus's chronology quite strongly here. I'm going to just zoom in on Pilate. This is the section in Antiquities where somebody later on inserted the famous Testimonium Flavianum because they wanted a nice place in Josephus where they could stick something about Jesus, so they chose this section. But there's a lot of talk here about Roman cruelty, the Romans' attitude towards foreign religions, etc. And Luke picks up on that and says Pilate mingled the blood of the Galileans with sacrifices. What is interesting here is that the later, shall we say, strongly redacted New Testament makes the Romans out to be quite nice guys, if I can say that. Pilate is presented as a philosophical leader who can find no fault in Jesus and then tries him by legitimate Roman law so they can find him genuinely innocent, so that when he dies, he's genuinely an innocent sacrifice that can pay for the sins of the world. So what Luke is doing, in a sense, as far as I'm concerned, is a form of what we call textual embarrassment, because perhaps this should have been taken out of the New Testament before the later Christology had become dominant, because he's telling us that Pilate was a bad guy, and he got that from Josephus most likely. The shipwreck narrative is fascinating. Obviously, one could be balanced here and say, well, you know, the Mediterranean was a terrible place to sail in those days. There are lots of storms. The Mediterranean is not a little lake. A lot of people died on the Mediterranean, and you didn't really have much choice. You're going to leave Caesarea, or you're going to leave a place like Ostia, for example, if you're traveling over the Mediterranean. So you have no choice. So if two people have a ship sailing on the Mediterranean, the chances are that there are going to be similarities. But the similarities between Josephus's shipwreck and Paul's shipwreck have interesting overlaps. They happened at almost the same time, and they both met their end in the middle of the Adriatic Sea, and we call that the Adria. It's it's an area of storms where a lot of ships meet their fate. Except that in the case of Paul, the ship was driven by winds for many, many days. I think it was 2 weeks, if I remember correctly, and eventually driven onto Malta. Whereas with Josephus, the ship broke apart and they were rescued by another ship. There's also a difference in the amount of people. It looks like Josephus's ship was much bigger, with 600 persons, and Paul mentions specifically 276, which gives the feeling that it's genuine. In Josephus' case, only 80 survived. In Paul's voyage, everyone survived. Both had people clinging to wreckage. Both were rescued. In Josephus' case, he managed to free priests who were being imprisoned in Rome at that time. That was why he went on this embassy. But Paul tells us that he landed on Malta and he was bitten by a viper. And everybody said he was going to die. And he just shrugged it off and lived because it was a miracle. And then he heals the sick, he wins their favor, and they continue safely to Rome. Now, as an aside, there are only 4 species of snake on Malta. 3 of them are whip snakes, and they are completely harmless. And the 4th one is this little chap called the European cat snake. And this snake is back-fanged, mildly poisonous, and I checked on the medical records. A bite from the snake is not medically significant. Okay, so in other words, it cannot harm a human being. I also tried to find out if it was an aggressive snake that would just randomly go up and bite somebody, because that's what happened to Paul. These snakes are extremely elusive. They only come out at night and they run away when they see any trouble, and they're very docile. And bites on humans are rare. So that story of the snake bite is pure fantasy. Okay, we can be rest assured on that one. I've just put this map in for a bit of fun. This shows you the red line is Paul, and the blue line is Josephus. And you can see that they both just coincidentally had their meeting of the storm in roughly the same place. So that's fascinating. And then we have other interesting conflations or contradictions that we need to look at, and then I'll be finished. We have first your faith-based timeline. This is your conservative Christian timeline. This is the stuff that they teach at the university to want to be pastors. This is the standard church history as enforced. It tells you that Saul was born in Tarsus, that he was a Benjaminite, that he trained directly under Gamaliel, and was also a Roman citizen. And in some traditions, it's claimed that Paul was so learned that he even served on the Sanhedrin. Now that is really amazing stuff. A Roman citizen serving on the Sanhedrin. He is the persecutor of Christians in Judea, and yet he tells us in Galatians 1:22 that he was unknown to the Judean churches. That doesn't make a lot of sense. And I'm sure Jacob will have something to say about that when we talk about pseudo-Pauls and possible other characters who may have muddied the waters here. He apparently approved the stoning of Stephen, and he also received letters from the high priest. Now, the high priest, between, I'd say, literally from 1 CE up to 61 CE, is a whole string of high priests, all of whom were Sadducees. Paul is supposed to be a Pharisee, studied under Gamaliel. The Sanhedrin in the late 30s, up to 37, had no jurisdiction in Damascus whatsoever. In fact, it was under the king of Nabatea at the time. And Paul even confirms that in 2 Corinthians. So Paul is confirming that he has no jurisdiction in Damascus, and yet he goes there quite happily, being commanded by a Sadducee high priest that he would want nothing to do with, to go and persecute people who are not actually Christian yet, because we're told somewhere else that they didn't even call themselves Christians at this time. They would have been Nazarites or Jewish people who maybe thought that Jesus was a wise teacher, but they're not fully fledged Christians yet. So why is he persecuting them? So this is also very interesting. This whole story doesn't make sense to me. We have the conversion on the road to Damascus. in Acts, he's baptized by Ananias. He spends 3 years in Arabia, and then he goes to Jerusalem where he meets Peter and James. But if you read through Acts, as Paul meets various people, the story of his conversion is different. It actually alters. And I just put that out there for a bit of fun. The first version, Saul goes to Damascus with the authority from the Sadducee high priest, and a light from heaven flashes. He falls to the ground and he hears a voice. But the people with him don't see anything. They just hear the voice. And then, of course, as you know, Saul is blind. He's led to Damascus, and he spends 3 days there, and then Ananias restores his sight. That's the basic story. And then a little bit later, he's talking to a Jewish crowd in Jerusalem, and he tells them that this light flash happened at noon. Saul fell to the ground, and then he heard Jesus's voice. And apparently there, the companions saw the light, but they didn't hear the voice. And then Ananias, described as a devout man respected by all Jews, restores his sight and then commissions Paul. So please notice, Ananias is commissioning Paul. But later, when Paul is before Agrippa, he says the light was brighter than the sun at noon, and everyone falls to the ground. Only Paul hears the voice of Jesus in Hebrew, nochol. Now, that's interesting, because surely Jesus spoke Aramaic in daily life, but maybe because he's God, he's speaking Hebrew because it's a language of prayer, I'm guessing. And he gives Paul a long speech in which he commissions Paul to be a servant and witness to Gentiles. So he gets the commission from Jesus, and there's no mention of Ananias whatsoever. Okay, so that's also very interesting. And we'll just end with this timeline of Paul and his associates. So we have the 3 great missionary journeys, which I won't go into detail. This is something that's always bugged me. If Paul really was alive in the 40s and 50s with his small band of, what would you call them, his sidekicks, preaching and spreading the word, how did he manage in under 2 decades to create all these churches all over Asia Minor? It doesn't make sense to me. Some people have said, no, he was very good at communicating, and he used to have people that were converted by him at each port, and then they would do the work for him. But even that sounds amazing. It really is. The only explanation that makes sense here is either the conversions took much longer than what we've been told, and they've been retrospectively placed into the 50s, or the climate was ripe for this new religion a long time before Jesus and Paul were even thought of, which I personally go with that, because if you look at Judaism in the 200 years before the time of Jesus, there's already this apocalyptic message of the end times, the kingdom of God, the getting right with God, because he's coming to fix everything. And that message has been around for at least 2 centuries before Jesus. So the possibilities are that the landscape had already been well prepared. Those are the only 2 explanations I can even begin to accept, because I don't believe that 6 people can convert Asia Minor in 2 decades. I just don't buy it. And then you have the arrest in Jerusalem, the trials with Felix, Festus, Agrippa, and an appeal to Caesar. Well, as you can imagine, there are no Roman records of any of these trials. And as we've just spoken about the shipwreck, when Josephus goes on his ship, it's to get from A to B. When Paul goes on the ship journey, it's to have a lovely literary adventure where lots and lots of things happen, like an historical chronicle. Completely different feeling about it. I'm just trying to. I think the most important thing here is that if you look at the content of New Testament more critically, there's a possibility that maybe some of the names of these associates are literary constructs. It's a possibility. And it's interesting that Acts exaggerates the harmony with Peter and James. But in Galatians, they are at each other's throat. Now, before I talk about pseudonymous authorship, just want to point out that in Hellenistic times, this was common. And it went on right up to the 5th and 6th centuries of the Common Era. In those days, it was, if you wanted to get your book read by people, then you didn't put your name on the cover, you put somebody else's name on the cover. This is almost like the opposite of plagiarism. Because, at the moment we have big problems with plagiarism in the universities. The students basically copy other people's work and claim it's theirs. In the Hellenistic period, it was the other way around. You wrote your own stuff and claimed somebody else wrote it, because then it's going to sell, all right? Because if your name is Galen, if you're a medical authority and you want your medical notes to sell, then you sell them as Galen. So Pseudo-Galen is a huge corpus of medical treatises. There are loads of these things, and they're all attributed to Galen, who lived in the 2nd century. And that Introductio Sive Medicus was written in the 6th century and still claiming to be 2nd century, replete with images, which are very similar to what Galen would have produced. Pseudo-Aristotle, we have Pseudo-Plutarch, we have Pseudo-Phoclides, we have Pseudo-Hippocrates. And in fact, the Pseudo-Hippocrates was used in medical schools, if you can believe this. Jewish Pseudepigrapha, as we all know, this is commonplace. There's something like 51 books pseudepigraphic. We have one Enoch, which is supposed to have been written by a prophet living before the flood. We have Testament of the 12 Patriarchs, which was supposedly attributed to the 12 sons of Jacob. We have Ezra, for Ezra. Also, there's a lot of Christian stuff in that one as well, which most of us know about. The Book of Jubilees is a rewritten Genesis, Exodus narrative. Philosophical and religious pseudepigraphy was very common. The Hermetica, loads of that stuff, normally attributed to Trismegistus, who's like a Hermes. The Chaldean oracles, and the Orphic hymns, the pseudo-Orphic hymns, attributed to the mythical poet Orpheus, but written much, much later in the Hellenistic period. And that actually is a page there of one of them. And Christian pseudepigrapha, there's tons of it. I mean, I'm just putting up some of the more well-known ones as the Pastoral Epistles, which was supposedly written by Paul in the early 2nd century. Acts of Paul and Thecla. This is a romance about Paul and a female disciple, Thecla, and he tells her that she must remain celibate, and she takes him up on the offer, and eventually she becomes one of his greatest students. 3 Corinthians. I've never read that myself, but I'd be interested to see what's in there.
That's very 3 Corinthians claims that Paul knew about the virgin birth. Yeah.
Apocalypse of Peter. Peter wrote that one apparently, and then we have the Gospel of Peter, another one attributed to Peter, and the Epistle of Barnabas. So Paul's companion also wrote something in 100 CE. And then we have Pseudo-Dionysius, the Areopagite, written as late as the 6th century, a fraudulent Christian mystical corpus attributed to Paul's Athenian convert in Acts 17. Okay, that was written by very late Neoplatonic Christians. So what I'm saying is, if pseudonymous authorship was common at that time, it should be no surprise to anybody that the New Testament suffered similar fate. We have, first of all, the historical fact there's very little reference to the Pauline letters before the middle of the 2nd century. There is some, but it's very, very sparse. For example, 1 Clement, Jacob was talking about this, he only wrote He only mentions one letter by Paul. A possible excuse here could be that he wanted to emphasize to the Corinthians that Paul had a special place in his heart for them, and he's writing about the letter that Paul wrote to the Corinthians, and that's why he used the singular. That is a possible way out of that problem for people who want to believe that there were, 10 letters by this time.
But the issue there, I would say, is...
I'm sure Jacob will have a lot to say about that. Yeah. Then we have Ignatius of Antioch, and depending how you read his text, if you read it literally, it looks like he's referring to letters written by Paul, but it could just be a way of speaking, that he's talking about Paul, but he's not talking about actual letters. So it's a little open to interpretation. Polycarp does mention letters, but they're all to the Philippians. So I'm assuming here we have 3 or 4 letters to the Philippians, which I don't know what happened to them. And then we have Marcion, of course, the most important, because he's our first indisputable witness to Paul in literature, and that's 140 BCE. Sorry, CE. Why have I got BCE? CE, okay? Common error. Okay, we end on this note. Marcion is the first known Christian to produce a fixed canon of scripture. So he's years ahead of the Council of Rome in 380. But he didn't like the Jewish aspect. Now, he was not an anti-Semitic person, as some people have claimed. What he didn't like was the theology. He wasn't anti-Jewish, he was anti-Jewish theology. And so, as most of us know, the jury is still out about the Evangelion, whether he took Luke's gospel and stripped it of Jewish content, or whether he had the original and then the later Christians added the Jewish stuff. The jury is out on that. But he did, if he removed the Jewish elements, then there's no reference to fulfillment of prophecy, because that would give the Judaism too much importance. And he softens the links to the Hebrew Bible. And as I mentioned, the status of the Evangelion is open to debate, whether it starts with Marcion or whether Marcion, he didn't interpolate, he expurgated it. Right. And then we have the Apostolicon, the first mention of 10 Pauline letters, and there they are. He called Ephesians Laodiceans, but they are basically the 10. He did not have the pastoral epistles. He didn't have Timothy, Titus, and Hebrews. So there's very strong evidence here that the Pauline letters were collected and edited and even composed in the early 2nd century in circles sympathetic to Pauline theology. And we mustn't forget there's a strong Gnostic link in there as well. And this was then retrojected back into 1st century texts, which I think happened to a lot of texts anyway in other circles. And as I've just said, pseudepigraphic letter writing is a well-known practice in antiquity. And we already know this. I mean, letters like Ephesians, Colossians, Thessalonians, etc., are widely suspected to be pseudonymous, as well as redacted from maybe more than one letter. The possibility you have 2 or 3 letters and then the bits have been taken out and put together to form another letter for didactic purposes, for teaching purposes. So let me leave it there. I think that just helps us get the mood, and then we can chat about it.
One thing that occurs...
Switch off the sharing. Okay, have I switched off the sharing, or everybody happy?
Can't hear Jacob.
You have to click the stop share button on the bottom.
Stop share at the bottom.
Yeah, you did it.
There, excellent.
Yeah, I want to comment on that thing and one Clement real quick. The funny thing is that Clement is not even he's not even being too specific about that letter that Paul wrote. What the title? Like, he doesn't tell us the title of it. It is just an assumption that that was a letter to the Corinthians.
Yeah.
And the other thing is that based on the fact that there are other parallels in 1 Clement, quasi parallels to canonical Paul. Like, for instance, he says that Paul had 7. Well, actually, this is a complete contradiction. Paul suffered 7 imprisonments, which is not in the New Testament.
Not bad for a Roman citizen. Yeah.
And then he says that Paul made it furthest west of the empire. Well, in Romans 15, Paul says he's going to go to Spain. Not that he made it there, but as Clement is concerned, he actually did make it furthest west of the empire. And if we're to believe, I actually think the way I look at it is I think Clement gives us the information, the closest information we're ever going to get to a historical Paul. I don't really trust anything in the canonical epistles. Not really. The issue is, this is what I tried to tell people many years ago, and I'm telling them again, that there's really no proof that these epistles existed. And this might be being generous to a degree before the 90s AD. There are some that I've had on my show that will say, like what you both are saying, that these others are actually 2nd century, because there's no proof that they're 1st century. That could be the case. And Nina Livesey doesn't think Paul even existed, or she thinks that Paul probably didn't exist, and she sees the canonical text as expanding the Marcionite edition. And either way, Clement's not attesting to a letter collection. He's not, regardless of how we slice it. And that's really the point that I really want to drive home to the audience. I like how you brought up Paul's death under Nero, because I think that was copied somewhat from Josephus. Because Josephus mentions a guy called Saul, and his brother Costabarus in AD 66. So the palace Herodium is burnt down by the Jewish rebels. A war has begun. Saulus and Costabarus go see Emperor Nero in Achaia, not in Rome. And the idea is that Saulus is going to lay blame of the Jewish war upon Governor Florus. After he goes there to do this deed, we never hear from him and his brother again. They're gone. Josephus never talks about the pair again. And I think what happened was, even though Josephus isn't explicitly telling us, I think they were executed because Josephus did say they caused a lot of trouble. He called Saulus a wicked man elsewhere. So what's going on with the Acts of Paul, a late 2nd century text, it's claiming that Paul was beheaded under Nero and then that he somehow was alive again. Anyway, the other thing about the Acts of Paul is it mentions a Roman soldier named Cestus. And in Josephus, there's the Roman commander Cestius, who had his whole army wiped out at the beginning of the Jewish war.
That's the only text where the Judahites flee to Cestius. In other words, they flee to the enemy, not to the hills. Which is, when I'm looking for the comparison there. Yeah,
and that tells me all I need to know about the Acts of Paul is copying Josephus, and is just like Acts, and I also even think the Pauline epistles are copying Josephus. And what's going on is the Acts of Paul is conflating the Saul that Josephus is talking about with the Paul in the letters. That's what it looks like to me. Yeah.
One thing I'd like you two to compare notes on is this business about Theudas. I know, Jacob, you differ from the common assumption that it's the Theudas that we're talking about in who was in
44. Yeah, in 44. Yeah.
There's a character in Josephus. I think he's in the Antiquities.
Yeah.
Called
at the time.
Theudian.
I think it was the time of Felix, wasn't it? Just trying to. It was 44, 46 CE.
So there's a character. There was a Jewish there was an individual that living under Herod the Great around 6 BCE, or maybe slightly earlier, named Fudian. I don't have the exact reference in front of me, but he was accused of plotting something, I think, against Herod. I don't exactly remember what he was accused of, and he was killed. And I think what probably happened was the author of Acts misremembered Fudian's name slightly, ironically because of the feudus that was mentioned. So I think he kind of slurred them together, kind of confused one with the other. And there was a similar situation in Acts, where I'm sorry, not Acts, 2 Corinthians, where the author of 2 Corinthians made a mistake when he was reading Josephus. Because when you go right after that passage where Saul and Castabris are going to Achaia to see Nero, the very next paragraph, it talks about, I think it's the next paragraph, but it's around there. It talks about some kind of chaos happening in Damascus, and I think the author of Acts I'm sorry, I mean 2 Corinthians. The author of 2 Corinthians misremembered. Said, "Oh, wait a minute. Saul fled from Damascus." No, he didn't. He fled from Herodium. And the historical Paul, if he did flee from King Aretas, he would have fled from Jerusalem when Herod Antipas was under assault from King Aretas. He would not have fled from Damascus. So besides, it was King Aretas III who had explicit control of Damascus 100 years earlier. So 2 Corinthians is just wrong all over the place when it's talking about this. It's kind of funny, but it's also kind of engaging in Old Testament imitation, because King Saul was chasing David, and King David was fleeing, and I think he was even lowered on a basket. It's very similar to Paul fleeing from Aretas, only that the names are sort of reversed and Aretas is involved, not a David. And Paul is the one fleeing, not the one persecuting. So it's kind of an irony, since Paul himself was also persecuting Jesus in the epistles, Jesus' followers, and Jesus is the son of David. So it's kind of like reverse imitations going on. And you see the same kind of thing in the Gospels and Revelation, when you have, many will come in my name and say that they are the Christ and deceive many. Well, Emperor Nero, they would have the false Neros impersonating him, say, "I'm Nero returned." While others believe that Nero really will come back. But Nero is also the beast in Revelation. So that's kind of weird. So it's kind of like, it's imitation on both sides of the fence. And that's the same kind of thing that applies with Paul in 2 Corinthians when it comes to the whole flight from Aretas and the imitation of David's flight from Saul.
Also, in the Synoptic Apocalypse, when it warns that there'll be people coming in my name saying, "I am he," that presumably is a vaticinium. What the heck is it? I can't think of the term. Ex eventu, where implying that this has already happened in the writer's day. Yeah. Does that mean there were people that claimed to be the resurrected Jesus, and that I'm appearing from heaven, and that, don't listen to them? I mean, I've never heard that suggested that I know of, but it certainly makes sense. Not necessarily that they're saying the hour has struck, let's fight Rome, but rather people that are saying, "I am Jesus of Nazareth, the Son of God, returned." I'd love to know more about that, though I gather there's no other accounts of it. But doesn't that mean there were people that claimed to be Jesus, and that might even reflect on the idea of the resurrection? People say, "Here, I'm back from the dead."
It might explain the situation in Quo Vadis, the Quo Vadis thing in the Acts of Peter, because the Acts of Peter claims that Jesus was somehow still alive in the 80s, 60s.
Mm.
And then Peter says,
Well,
let
he
me
came
get...
back from India.
Yeah,
And Peter is claiming, look, man, I don't want you getting nailed again. So I'll get crucified for you, upside down too. So you see, so you'll be amazed. I'm unworthy to be crucified in exactly the same manner as you. I got to be upside down, man.
Mm-hmm.
There's another issue I want to quickly just throw in here. I have mentioned this before. It seems to me that it's a Gentile audience that needs this flesh and blood Jesus and the story behind it, the family and the brothers and what happened to him, because he's going to be a real person. But if you think of the Gnostic influences on Christianity, where they're borrowing terms, give you one term, the Christos. At that time, Christos also referred to the pouring of oil over a bust of a god. It was oiled. It was anointed so that it was the Christos. That was a term that was used. And for some reason, somebody has now taken that Christos and confused it with Mashiach, that it means anointed one, and now it becomes Jesus's title. He's Jesus the Christ, not Jesus Christ. But when that started, there was no physical Jesus needed. You had a Christos in the Gnostic system, one of the emanations of the monad, who comes and restores Sophia, wisdom, because she's messed up, and that which explains the demiurge being separate and physical to the pleroma, which is the ineffable, inexplicable, non-comprehensible oneness, which is now replacing the old idea of God, which later Catholicism picked on, turned him into God the Father, this sort of new form. But when you start getting into the Gentile world, who are now accepting this religion in a literalist sense, and not in a mystical, open form, they're now demanding, who is this guy? What did he look like? What was his family like? And I get the feeling that this was made up later and then retrospectively fed in. So you have another layer here which makes it very problematic, because there was no, in my opinion, there was no real flesh and blood person called Jesus running around. There may have been a number of, holy men walking around, loads of those. I mean, Josephus tells us there are loads of them. Many people called Jesus as well. I mean, I could just remember one. What about Jesus of Ananias, who walked up to the temple and said, woe is, Jerusalem, woe is Jerusalem. And then he was a really nasty person. He didn't accept any favors from people, and he was always disgruntled. And apparently he walked up to the temple and said something like, oh, woe is me. And he was hit by a rock from a mangonel, which was quite amusing. I mean, there's a lot of that story of Jesus of Ananias that sounds a lot like some of the things that Jesus of Nazareth would have done. The same sort of attitude. Okay, so it's and another thing. If you were really smart and clever, I'm just thinking of people like Hillel the Elder. They are famous for having witty, pithy sayings. If you can make lots of ironic sayings, then you're very smart. So, the least of you will be the most, or the last will be the first. And, these kind of sayings are very common at that time. You just have to read the Talmud. I mean, just read Hillel's statements. If I'm not for me, who is for me? And, that kind of stuff. And that really appealed to them. They loved that. And also the metaphors which are based on agriculture, because these people are growing stuff in the ground. So obviously they're going to talk about thorns and seeds which don't grow in the soil, and and water and wine, in wineskins that have gone bad. This is their culture. And now it's being portrayed as though it's very deep and sophisticated, which I don't buy at all. It's just, when we say the Son of Man is coming, well, the Son of Man means basically you're a human being. That doesn't mean that you're something special. But we have this idea that we've created this myth around these titles and wording. So I think there is this other layer to it, this desperate need to create a physical, historical person who could address the Gentiles' needs for something literal. Because Christianity became literal, very literal.
Mm-hmm.
And I think there they borrowed. They borrowed from other religions and other ideas. And I think that just makes the water even more muddy. Yeah.
And there's a passage in. Oh, go ahead, Bob.
Just an aside about the quips and so on. At the Jesus seminar, Bob Funk once actually put it up for a vote that Jesus should be viewed as the first Jewish stand-up comic, and they didn't go for it, but he meant it seriously. Of course, I like that because my whole function at the Jesus seminar was to be the stand-up comic at the Saturday night banquets, and was that fun. Anyway, but
there's.
But he would be more like Stephen Wright with one-liners, right? Because he doesn't.
Yeah, there's a brilliant.
There's no laughter there. There's no humor.
Just makes you think. Wow.
Yeah.
Yeah. I love that guy.
There's a passage in 1 Corinthians. I don't exactly remember where, but I know it's in there, where it's stated, don't worship God in buildings subject to the flames. I'm like, and then it says the temple is inside you. So it's like it's justifying, don't rebuild the temple. We don't need it. Because the temple is inside you. You don't want to do it anyway because it'll just burn up again.
Mm-hmm.
And it's a weird thing because like I'm supposed to believe that was written in the 50s. It doesn't make any sense. That's got to be like way after 80-70 for that to make any sense to me. That's not before 70, not a chance. And it's funny because they'll try to say, oh, this is an interpolation, or that's an interpolation in Paul's letters. These are what I call hypothetical interpolations.
Yeah.
They're like, well, you're not sure it's an interpolation. You just think it is. Well, the thing is, it's that little, like the wrath of God in 1 Thessalonians 2:14-16 is in every manuscript of that chapter, 1 Thessalonians. And that other thing about the don't worship God in buildings that could be set ablaze, that's in all the manuscripts of 1 Corinthians that I'm aware of. So you can't really justify that's interpolation. Everything else is somehow early. You take out that part you got a problem with, everything else is somehow early. Come on.
No. What are your, both of you, what do you think about or what's your perception of the early Christianity, New Testament scholarly field or discussion, when I like the way you had the faith-based chronology and then the real chronology. What's with how do you have these factions of what I consider apologists versus critics? How can they coexist in something like the Society of Biblical Literature? It just seems to me almost like you got the Presbyterians and the Baptists. They're not going to be able to have much of a useful conversation. How do they get along? I mean, can they join in common scholarly endeavors? It doesn't seem like, I don't see how they could.
Well, I think we can take our cue here from Constantine the Great. There was a reason why he called the Nicene meeting, in 325. He wanted to use Christianity as a means of governing the empire because he thought there's no point beating these guys anymore like Diocletian. Let's use them. I mean, he was smart. But he had a problem. Those Christian groups by the 4th century were all diverse. We know that. They were all isolated little groups with their own literature. I don't think any of the literature I don't think many of them shared common literature, or they had their own flavors, maybe, of the Gospels. They didn't have the same gospel or the same letters. They had and some of them had their own literature. which was completely separate. And I mean, we see that now in stuff that, like the Coptic Church, and in the Eastern world, we see all sorts of strange things coming up. I mean, just the Gospel of Thomas as an example. I mean, it doesn't even fit in with what we know. It's strange because we've only just recently found this stuff in the last 100 years. But there must have been a time when there was hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of books flying around, certainly after 3 centuries, with their own agendas, their own Christologies, as I say, literalism, Gnosticism, all sorts of flavors, and also crossovers, because we were told, I forget who said it, that they watched priests of Serapis performing a ritual in Egypt, and they didn't know whether they were Christians or worshipping Serapis. Now that tells you a lot. And we also have, brain's gone out of the top of my head now, one of the first converts of Christianity, it'll come to me just now, but brain's gone dead. He was upset because he realized that the mysteries of Mithras were having baptism and they were having Eucharists before the Christians ever even thought of it. And that, so that the word went out that Satan had done this on purpose so that he could insult Jesus later on. Okay.
Yeah.
So what we're dealing with here are not just dozens, scores of different groups, all isolated in their different parts of the world, doing their own thing. And in many ways, we can thank Constantine because he's forcing these guys to get together, if you like, and say, make up your mind, guys. What is the dogma now? And you know what happened overnight? Suddenly the Arians are heretics. I mean, what?
And then they kept switching back. Athanasius, pack your bags. What do you mean? I won. Then, okay, come on back. No, you're a heretic again. Boy, this guy must have been confused.
The slavish borrowing of Plotinus, for example, to come up with a Blessed Trinity concept. If you understand how you get from Plato to Plotinus and all the debates, and then you go to the Nicene story where they're now working out the Trinity. I mean, it's a ripoff. It's almost like they were desperate for some answers there. And I don't think this was a very educated group either. I mean, we know, for example, there's spelling mistakes in some of the Koine Greek texts, which shows you that the writers were not that proficient. They were not top scholars. And I don't think the majority of the faithful were educated at all. They were illiterate. I can imagine that whoever masterminded the texts and interpolated those is your very rare individual, and then somebody else has to read it to the faithful who probably sat on the floor cross-legged and listened to it without any understanding of where this is coming from, and no means to say, hey, you've just mentioned Theudius, but he lived 40 years differently. They didn't have that ability. And the fact that nobody mentioned it for 400 years tells you these people were not critical. They're not critical.
They weren't stupid. They just weren't scholars. They had the option to be even.
And then you have the whole issue, which we've discussed before, that when you come to the age of the great apologists like Origenus and Eusebius, they've always assumed that what they've been teaching is true. There's no doubt about it. And now they're getting criticized by people like Celsus, who's saying, you're talking nonsense. And what do? They suddenly realize that there is no information. There is no historical evidence for what they believe. So they make it up. Okay. And that's the truth of it. They did make it up. And they didn't see it as a bad thing. They had no choice. They're doing God a favor. I mean, God just forgot to write this down. So they did it for him. It makes sense. And we've got tons of evidence for that. Tons of evidence for that.
Yeah, boy, and they're still making some of it up. There are these fake gospels that are being fabricated now. The gospel of Jesus' wife, a little postage stamp and all that. And Karen King, unfortunately, fell for that one. And we still don't know what to think of Morton Smith's Secret Gospel of Mark and other things. Oh, my favorite little bit about the history of the Council of Nicaea and so forth, somehow we happen to have this. Somebody mentioned it, I don't know where, but that Constantine figured he'd better get this straightened out because it wouldn't die down. And that even in the waterfront taverns, you had guys trading drinking songs about the hypostatic union, like, oh, he's not with his father. I guess it was popular. I mean, supposedly that's true. Oh boy. Or I think I forget which rabbi, when they were debating should the Song of Solomon retain its place in the canon, there were guys singing that as erotic love poetry, which it was. But they said, "Oh no, we can't have that. No, it's really about God." And the
people forget that in Judaism we don't have a hang-up about sex.
Mm-hmm.
Okay,
mm-hmm.
It's natural and it's great, and you celebrate God with it.
Yeah,
but when Christians got hold of it, it became big taboo.
mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Oh boy! And then you have the Encratites, like Paul and Thecla and all that stuff. Boy, there's you see what happens when to groups like that with the Shakers, who are kind of a reincarnation of the Encratites. Well, they're gone now. Good thing they made some good furniture, because that's all that's left of them. You better start proselytizing fast if you want this to keep going, but didn't work.
It's unfortunately it's a morass. It's an omelet, and we can't get back to the eggs, I'm afraid. To reconstruct what happened over 400 years, it's going to be impossible. The best that for me, the best I can do is when I see something that doesn't ring true, or sounds out of place in terms of where the Christology had got to at that time, then I think there's something genuine about that. Because, I mean, we discussed this before, like, for example, the baptism of Jesus by John, how that evolves through the Gospels. It starts off with an obvious, John does it, and it ends up with no mention of it because they don't want to talk about it anymore. Because John is too lesser a being to baptize a deity. But he wasn't a deity originally. He was a wise teacher, so it didn't matter. And when you see that, then that gives me hope that maybe there was somebody who was baptized by John.
Could be. It
could be. And then you think, well, that makes sense. That rumor that maybe John was in fact in the scene, that makes sense. And this other guy who was his disciple then went off on his own with his own following. That makes sense.
Oh, that happens all the time, even now.
Yeah.
By the principle of analogy, nothing strange about it. Yeah, boy, I love that when you compare those things, like when in the Gospel of the Ebionites, or one of them, Mary is there in Galilee reading the Galilee Gazette and says, hey, it says here, John the Baptist is baptizing people for the forgiveness of sins. Let's go, pack up. And Jesus says, what do you mean? You're saying I committed some sin? Well, I don't need to go to this thing. I mean, that just couldn't be more obvious. And finally, here's old John the Evangelist cutting the Gordian knot. Jesus doesn't even get baptized. It's hilarious. Oh, boy. Though I don't feel, I know I sound like I'm scorning this, but it's just the reverse. I love all of this stuff. I just love it more when I can really understand what's going on.
No, it's a fascinating study, and it's just upsetting that we'll never really know. We'll never know.
Yeah, it's the old Socratic.
It's the price you pay for being an academic.
Yep. Yeah.
Devoted to never finding out.
Yeah, I mean, the more I read about the different interpretations of everything and different arguments for plausibility, but unproven, not capable of being proven, this and that theory, I really approach total agnosticism about this. There's just no way to be sure of anything. So what is the point of biblical scholarship anymore? Well, it's just to explore and discuss the possibilities, because you'll never, like Pyrrho with the skeptics said, if you could, if there were any definitive arguments, these debates would all have been settled centuries ago. And I don't see, barring some kind of verifiable super discovery, it's never going to change. And even there, people, there are people that even say, I had a pastor once who said, if you, if they said they discovered the bones of Jesus and could prove it, if you really are a Christian, you'd believe anyway. That's, I mean, then you're admitting you're often.
Well, he's actually right, because that would happen.
Oh yeah, well,
because
yeah.
If you come with facts, nobody's interested in facts.
Right.
I mean, that's.
I wrote a book called Secret Scrolls, Revelations from the Lost Gospel novels. And I came up with over 40 of these novels, like Irving Wallace's The Word, and loads of them. And my idea here was, what do these different authors think it would take to blow the lid off of Christianity? Because this gospel they discover says one thing, or they find the body of Jesus, and so they're conspiracies so that it doesn't get out to the public. I thought, are they kidding? I mean, look at the Nag Hammadi thing. They did find new gospels. Did that make any impact at all? No. I mean, nobody would pay attention if they even knew about it. Jeez. Oh boy, what a riot.
I'm going to take a couple of super chats real quick. Solara Knight, thank you for your super chat. To trick the early Christians of a literary fictional character, such as Jesus Christ, as a far grand usurpation for second century clandestine conspirators. Any thoughts on that?
To trick the early.
Well, I don't see it as a trick. I just see it that my personal feeling is that largely your Gentile audience, who are now accepting Christianity, full-blown Christianity by, say, the end of the 2nd century, it's become very literal, and they don't see it as metaphorical, allegorical. They don't see it as mystical. They see it as factual. 2 and 2 equals 4, end of story. And so they're asking questions. They're saying, well, who is this Jesus? It's also interesting. I mean, Yeshua, means savior, or something similar to savior, not in the sense that we're talking about saving, but redeemer. And that's another reason why I have a problem with this, because if you are the redeemer and you were baptized with that name, redeemer, that's a bit
what a
problematic for me.
coincidence.
Yeah, if his name had been Matthias or Mattiyahu or something like that, I would have accepted it, but I don't. I just just don't accept it when it's just too obvious. And I think this is the problem. Literal people want something that they can hold in their hand and see. That is one of the big, I'm generalizing here, and that's dangerous, but the difference between the Latin West and the Greek-speaking East is one understands the subtleties, the more, the ephemeral aspects of life. Call it spiritual, if you like. Whereas the West wants blood, bones, flesh, and monuments to remember the dead. They want things they can hold in their hand. They can actually feel it and see it. Seeing is believing. And that is one of the big differences between the two groups. And you'll notice that in the West, it eventually evolved into a situation where you have relics of sacred people. And those relics are just as important as anything else in the religion. People walk on their knees for miles to see a relic in a church. That was the faith they had in it. They didn't have medicine; they had relics. If you've got toothache, you're going to go to somewhere. If you're a cripple, you're going to go to the church that's got the remains of St. Giles. All right, and if it's motherhood, you go to the remains of St. Gerard. And these saints all have roles to play in that system, and they have to have their physical remains there. But in the East, They are more interested in icons. And the icon is not an idolatrous object as many Christians think. It's like for example, there's no more idolatrous than singing a hymn. If you're singing a hymn, it's not idolatrous.
Mm-hmm.
If you write a poem of praise to God, that's not idolatrous. Mm. Those paintings, those icons are not meant to be images of the divine. They are gateways to the divine. They allow you to access the divine as a prayer or a hymn does. You see, that's the problem. When the West looks at the East, they go, oh, idolatry. Because they're used to physical remains. They want physical things that look like something. And that's the big difference. I'm generalizing, but that tends to be the situation. Latin versus Greek, you can split it with a knife, those two differences, those two sides.
Well, the one, the more Eastern view reminds me of something in John chapter 12, where Jesus summons everybody and says, he who believes in me believes not in me, but in him who sent me. That is really profound. He doesn't say, hey, stop believing in me. No, he says, you believe in me. What is it? What are you really doing? If you've got it right, I'm the launch pad for your faith in the Father. It's like the Zen thing where this guy says, well, what is this moon I hear about? Where is it? And, right there, and he says, you mean your hand is the moon? No, I'm pointing to the moon. And that's kind of the idea of the icon too. Is anybody?
That's more Jesus, the wise teacher, that you're presenting there. You know, a wise teacher who can get people to open their eyes and see things for the first time.
Oh boy, great stuff. I find that.
Go ahead, Bob. Finish.
I back in undergraduate years when I was in InterVarsity in evangelical Christianity and so on, even then I knew I became a religion major, and I knew that I needed to learn about the other religions and religion in general before I could really understand my own. And that has made all the difference. You get the kind of Joseph Campbell thing. It's hard to have an allegiance to any one, but you have an appreciation for all of them. You don't deny their errors or their limitations, but you begin to see and hear the symphony of the whole thing as a great creation of the human spirit. So I'm pro-religion, even though I'm not sure there's any kind of a God.
Yeah, The Hero with 1,000 Faces, 1949. Yeah. Brilliant book. Yeah.
Is there, Nadia Vet Chambers, thank you for your super chat. Is there any records of Roman trials? Why expect Paul's?
Yeah, this is a perfectly good question. All I said was that given that the Bible mentions so many trials by so many top-class people, I mean, the chances of you getting tried by Felix or Festus to your face, you know, this is why I find the Jesus trial so amazing. I mean, he's supposed to be this outcast man, and yet he gets Pontius Pilate directly to try him. I mean, that doesn't make sense. You know, what, some humble carpenter from Galilee who can't even speak proper Hebrew now gets trotted off to Pontius Pilate. The same with Paul. You know, he gets trotted out to all these famous people. They're all mentioned there. If you read through the New Testament, who did he not get tried by? You know, and all I'm saying is, considering all the people he went to, we have not one record of these trials. And of course, I'm not expecting to find records of everybody's trial. I mean, that's obvious. But it's interesting that given how many famous people tried him, there's not one mention. That's all I'm saying. That doesn't prove anything. It's just interesting. Because I don't believe for a moment that somebody who's causing an upset in the forum is going to be frog marched off to the boss. I just don't buy it.
Yes,
you try. I want you to go into the street and proclaim that you're the Messiah and see where you end up. I promise you, Donald Trump won't call you into his office and say, I find no guilt in him. You know, it just won't happen.
reminds me of what Pilate says in Jesus Christ Superstar. Who is this Jesus? Why is he different? You Jews produce messiahs by the sackful. Yeah, I mean, they're supposedly even today, you trip over the supposed messiahs. And it couldn't have been that big a deal. Like you've got the famous war criminal coming in, or it's the Nuremberg trials or something.
Yeah. No, the trial of Jesus, for example, is, to my mind, definitely a means of saying that he was tried properly. Because Roman law counted. I mean, we're dealing with 4th century mindset here. They wanted their guy to be approved as innocent by the best court, and that's a Roman court. End of story. Christianity is a Roman religion. Let's not kid ourselves.
And the trajectory of this, where Pilate himself is converted to Christianity and becomes canonized as a saint, which he is even today in the Ethiopian church. And because it's this exoneration thing, well, he tried to release him. And I think you find that kind of thing already in Matthew with his wife's dream. And she says, hands off of this guy. I've suffered much because of him in a dream. What is that supposed to mean? Well, it sounds to me like she's having a precognitive dream of becoming a Christian martyr. What is that? Does she just mean I was tossing and turning because of it? She could be, but it sounds to me increasingly legendary.
Yeah, shades of Calpurnia. Huh?
Yeah, boy. Fascinating.
Got a couple of more super chats. Always ask why 5 times. Thank you for your super chat.
Nice.
Solara Knight, thank you for your super chat. Scientology.
Whoa. There's a dangerous one to be a heretic in.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's interesting that people give up. There's a lot of as we enter this very secular world, people are giving up mainstream religions left, right, and center. And people, I mean, the churches in England, for example, are emptying quite rapidly. But I find it very interesting that having chucked up something that they realize doesn't make sense, they would then chase after something that even makes even less sense. You know, why would you want to believe that we are descendant from aliens? What? This really gets me.
Good old Francis Schaeffer, militant fundamentalist and pseudo-intellectual that he was, he had occasional insights. He said he had a little booklet called The New Super Spirituality, and he says people are throwing over traditional Christianity, and the odd thing is when they stop believing in that, they'll believe anything else. And he's talking about the cults and all this. Well, he's sort of right. I mean, you're no longer a skeptic, just skeptical of this.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's unbelievable to me, and I've really learned over the years, especially this year, just how close-minded a lot of these so-called atheists really are. Like, especially the ones that are like wedded to the consensus views on the New Testament. Unbelievably, what might seem unbelievable is what I'm about to say.
Very surprising.
There are times I've gotten along better with some Christians than I did with some of the dogmatic atheists that are all about just filled with vitriol and hatred. It's like, and then you wouldn't expect them to defend the 8050s Paul, but for some reason they do.
Oh, of course they need that because of the old argument that, hey, these earlier texts don't know anything about a historical Jesus. So it plugs into their argument in a certain way. I mean, that's not a bad argument, but they can't really rethink it or consider an alternative because that knocks a hole in their particular version of mythicism.
Yeah. There's a difference between somebody. Well, first of all, I want to say this. People call me an atheist, all right? And I don't like that word because then I'm also an A-flat earthist, or I'm an A. It's a stupid thing. I'm a scientist. End of story. And science is a humble pursuit. Humble. We don't have all the answers, but we have the best answers at the time. That's a difference. Okay. And as a matter of interest, I've said this to people, if we suddenly all got amnesia and all the books and all the knowledge in the world was destroyed, in 100 years' time, there'll be new religions and there'll be the same science. Okay? So that is why I'm a scientist. Because it's the most, okay? Now, somebody who becomes an atheist through thinking and critical awareness and self-actualization and really goes through that process would never be arrogant about being an atheist. But there are some people who are converted to atheism, very much they're converted to a religion, and they turn it into a religion. Like science is not a religion, but they turn it into a religion. And that's when they get it wrong, because as soon as you stop being humble, as soon as you stop, if you start becoming arrogant, I mean, you've lost it. It doesn't matter how much you know nothing in terms of infinity. You know nothing. You might know more than your neighbor, but you yourself, you're ignorant.
Yeah.
And I take a Socratic line here. So
read my mind.
Yeah, I've said this many times as a joke. I said, if somebody can come into my office and convince me that the Earth is flat with scientific evidence, I'll believe it. It's as simple as that. Okay, but it's got to be good evidence.
That's true. I mean, I always, when I hear something that sounds outrageous about the Bible or whatever, especially, I'm eager to hear why they think what they do, because maybe there's something I've been missing. And that's at least a couple of times that has happened to me. Somebody had with literary theory with deconstruction. I read some stuff about it by friends, and I thought, what the heck, this guy's losing his mind. And then I thought, wait a minute. He's no fool. There must be some method in the seeming madness. And so I started reading a lot on it. I said, son of a gun, I get it. Or the claim that the Sodom and Gomorrah story has nothing to do with homosexuality. I read that and said, oh, come on, get out of here. And then I read the details. And oh my God, he's right. Well, hey, I welcome that. Please show me I'm wrong. It's exciting to discover and not to be immune from being corrected.
Yeah, the other, I forgot what I was just about to say, actually. So while I try to remember that, I'm gonna address this next super chat. Slower Night, thank you for your super chat. Science has the search for truth if pursued religiously is a religion.
If you pursue it religiously,
yeah, it's because he misspelled the word there.
It's not a religion because you're not fixating on one thing dogmatically and saying that's the only answer there is, and I'm going to die believing that. As a scientist, I can change my opinion next second. That's the difference. Religions, you believe something and you live your life according to that belief, and you don't want to change. In fact, I remember when I converted to Catholicism when I was 12, I had to do it because my father wanted to become a Catholic. And the first thing the priest said to me was, you're not allowed to read anything that will make you not be a Catholic. And that was when I realized I didn't want to be a Catholic. Because that isn't how it works, If you're a religion, you're not allowed to think out the box.
So much for universalism.
Yeah. It's universal because we all got to believe it. All right.
That's the irony of it.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
And yes, you could be very focused as a scientist, but as I said, the humble part's got to be there, because as soon as you become the hubris destroys any attempt to get knowledge. I mean, there are all sorts of little witty sayings like the angry man can't teach and the angry man can't learn and all those things. That's tied up to it. You've got to be critical. You've got to be aware. And a thing I find with people in the modern age is there's a lot of people, especially on social media, who get stuck on some issue, and they moan and complain and they thump their fists, but they're looking at one little issue out of context. They haven't seen the big picture. And you can't actually comment on anything until you've done all the reading and you've looked at everything around that issue. You can't just say, women drivers are bad. You're going to look at the big picture. And that's the problem. I see that as a big problem. You get very intelligent people saying really incredible things, which are very logical, but they're talking about things out of context. I remember when I used to teach history of ceramics, when you're dealing with Japanese and Chinese ceramics, and especially looking at the Sung dynasty, which is a very poetic, very artistic dynasty. The artists in that period allowed randomness and chance to be incorporated in the intent. Very, very, that fine edge of happenstance between what is observed and intentional and that which happens by itself. And they would practice that. It's a peripheral way of looking at the world. So if you're in a room and you're talking to your students, you're also aware of the sounds that the air conditioner is making. At the same time, the traffic passing in the street. You're looking at the whole picture. But in the West, we don't do that. We take an item like a coffee cup, we take it out of the kitchen, we put it under the microscope, we examine it, we weigh it, we check what it's made of, and we write a report. And we know nothing about drinking coffee out of that thing because it's been examined completely in isolation. That's the difference between the West and the East in a nutshell. And that's the same as science. Science has to be done in context.
I remember what I was going to say. Oh, Nick, did I interrupt you, Nicholas, or were you finished? Nicholas, can you hear me?
Sir. Yes,
yeah. Yes. Did I interrupt you? I didn't mean to.
No, you didn't interrupt me.
Okay.
No,
okay.
Yeah,
no, I remember what I was going to say.
I'm just having a free flow of consciousness here.
Yeah, keep it going.
Yeah, I remember what I was going to say. I'm tired of like this historicist versus mythicist debate centering around Paul's letters, a man who never met Jesus. I mean, it's kind of, so to me, it's kind of stupid that it should center around letters of a man that never met Jesus. Why is it going to center around him? It's like it's a circular argument.
If there was somebody, let's call him Paul for want of a better argument, had a Gnostic leaning, because they were Gnostics at that time. There was a Christ in Gnosticism, and that Christ was a spiritual aspect. It was an emanation of the monad. So if there was somebody who believed that would have worked. The problem is when somebody now reads that later, after it's been interpolated and changed and fiddled with, they're now thinking that this Christ is a person, a physical person called Jesus. And that's when it goes off track. So perhaps Paul's been made to say things later which make him more in line with literal Christianity, but I still think that the foundation for that thinking was pure Gnosticism. And Jesus was not a physical being. He was a spiritual entity, closer to Docetism, if I can use that, the Docetist idea of Jesus being a spirit, phantom, who went through the motions. And even that is more physical than pure Gnosticism, because Gnosticism is not physical at all. He's pure energy. You can only know him through spiritual knowledge, okay, where you become a pneumatic. And once you're a pneumatic and no longer sarclic or hylic and earthly and fleshly, then you are one with the pleroma and you're one with the monad. And after death, you basically are absorbed, if you like. You have no individuality. You're part of the one. It's a very different way of looking at things. Christianity is more materialistic. It's about pie in the sky when you die, saving up your treasures. You're going to have a repeat of what you have here in the next world. That isn't Gnosticism.
I think that mythicism, well, Frank Zindler always says he thinks that historically what passes for the idea of a phantom Jesus. He was really there, but you couldn't really touch him, etc. He says that no, it was mythicism. That was denying that he ever appeared at all to anybody except maybe in a vision. Well, I think that the modern equivalent to that, in a sense, is to say we can't prove there was a historical man named Jesus. And furthermore, it doesn't make any difference because we know we do have the Jesus character in the Gospels, and he has a lot to say. I mean, does it negate the Sermon on the Mount because you can't prove that he exists? What the heck? I mean, what's more important? And it seems to me it's on Ronald Ayer's old show, The Long Search, where he traveled all over the world and discussed religions with their adherents, he asks a Zen abbot, he says, I've talked to Buddhists that believe that the Buddha existed, that he didn't, and what do you think? And the abbot said, well, as for the Buddha, for those who need him to exist, he exists. For those who don't need him to exist, he doesn't. Like that's, I think, yeah, that's kind of right. We cannot recover the past. So what have we got now?
Yeah, there's a Buddhist maxim that says, if you meet Buddha on the way, you must kill him.
Because he can't be the real thing. You got to look in the mirror for that.
That's very similar to Maimonides talking about God. You can't speak about that concept in a positive sense. Because as soon as you say something, you limit it.
Apophatic theology.
That's right.
We can't really describe them, but at least we can get a bit more away from ignorance.
Yeah. And of course, Maimonides himself was a Gnostic. I mean, we know that. I mean, the way he speaks about God, it's Gnosticism, pluralism.
Wow. Like the reason I am a historicist, because somebody asked me in the chat if I'm a historicist or Memphis. I'm a historicist. I've always been a historicist. But because the way I look at the evidence for historical Jesus is, I look at Clement talking about there was Jesus lived and died. I look at early apostolic fathers, just the general idea that there was a man called Jesus who was crucified. He suffered crucifixion. Crucifixion was a common form of execution in the first century by the Romans. I don't need to think that any of the texts of the New Testament are necessarily early to arrive at that conclusion. That's the false dichotomy there. Oh, I need Paul in the 50s because somehow I can't think somebody got crucified under Pilate without Paul in the 50s. That doesn't make sense. I can believe somebody was crucified under Pontius Pilate with the name Jesus or Yeshua in the 80s, while thinking that Paul's letters were written in the 90s AD or later. They don't go together. I don't need letters of a supposed man who supposedly wrote them supposedly in the 50s, who never even met Jesus. You see, when you think about it, it just sounds ridiculous.
And yet he's the founder of the religion, apparently.
Yeah.
I'd say, but he's the founder of the religion.
Yeah, that's why you have these.
But was he? Was he the founder? Was he the founder?
Right.
You know, they used to have in the early days of modernism, they'd say there was the Galilean gospel of Jesus, the religion of Jesus, pure piety centered on the Father and the brotherhood of man. But then Paul came along and changed everything so that it wasn't the religion of Jesus anymore, but the religion about Jesus. And so that these people were like Harnax, let's get back to the religion of Jesus. But I think what has happened is that if you want to draw that distinction, Protestantism has said, well, so be it. We're believing in the religion about Jesus. And so that's why in the Jesus seminar, in my experience, from day one when I got involved with it, I could see they were willing to throw Jesus to the wolves. Did he really say anything or do anything that it says? Well, who knows? But Paul, because there was a Paul seminar part of it. And he said, no, I don't believe these are really by Paul and so on. Oh, you're crazy. Why? Why the double standard? Well, because these guys have a residual Protestant conscience. And for them, Jesus is secondary. It's Paul. It's like they're like Lutherans in that sense. They're historical critics and all that, but still, Paul is the most important one because Jesus doesn't teach theology. But Paul does, and that's how they don't even exactly believe it anymore personally, but still he's really the figurehead. It's like in 1 Corinthians, some are saying, I am of Paul, and others, I am of Christ. They're not necessarily the same.
No, good point. Sure.
And I want to go back to what we were talking about earlier about like when you look at the earlier traditions about the baptizer John, it's clear that Jesus' death wasn't the original atonement. Now, I know some think that the John passage in Josephus is an interpolation, but if it is by Josephus, and Josephus is telling us that he's aware of the idea that John the Baptist is baptizing for the remission of sins. In the Gospel of the Hebrews, it also says this, that John the Baptist baptized the remission of sins. There was no concept that Jesus' death was what was the mechanism for being cleansed from sins. I remember when I had Bart Ehrman on a couple of times on discussing this issue about the sin, the mechanism for the cleansing of sins. He mentioned that across the Gospels, one of them doesn't have that, and that's Luke. That Luke Acts never mentions that Jesus' death is a mechanism for redemption. And he thinks that Luke was hearkening back to earlier tradition. He's not quite sure how it is. I think he thinks it was oral tradition somehow. I think Luke was aware of earlier sources, given what he says in the beginning of his gospel. I knew many sources. So, okay, so he knew many. I think he knew older sources, older traditions, in which John was employing the mechanism for the redemption, not Jesus, which was a problem. You can't have John doing this. You got to have Jesus doing it. You got to transfer that over to Jesus. It can't be simple baptism, because then anybody can do baptism and get out of it. You don't need Jesus. You got to centralize it to Jesus, which is what the Gospels generally do. Is that they centralize it to Jesus. It's that Jesus' death, the belief in his death and resurrection, and him as the Son of God is what redeems people from sins.
Well, that's
Jacob? Yeah. Oh, sorry. No. You go first, Robert. I was going to say something about Origenus to do with the baptism of John the Baptist. Yes. Carry on, Robert.
Oh, well, just a footnote. Harnack pointed out, though I guess it should have been obvious, that Jesus, now he took a lot more as actual history than I would, but he said, do you mean to tell me that Jesus would teach something like the parable of the prodigal son, the whole point of which is it's never too late to ask for forgiveness. Don't worry, come on, just repent and God will forgive. Could Jesus possibly have been teaching that if in the back of his mind he says, well, of course, this is plan A, but plan B comes into effect in a few months when you're going to have to believe in my death and resurrection and so forth. No, that's absurd. These are two very different gospels, hence the religion of Jesus, the religion about Jesus. And I've always thought, yeah, something is really askew here because it's the same thing with John the Baptist. If he's baptizing for remission of sins, isn't that it? I mean, the whole point is you got to wipe the slate clean because the end of the world is coming. That's it. I mean, there's no room for this, the crucifixion or anything like that.
Well, that ties in what I was going to say about Origenus very quickly. First of all, if Jesus, the historical Jesus or the historical Jesuses, which were used as the narrative to fill the literal needs of later Gentiles, that individual would have been a Jew. Okay. And under Judaism, you don't need to make right with God by killing yourself. You can simply admit your mistake and turn back with teshuvah. And so Jesus saying something like you just have to beg for forgiveness, that makes sense. That's exactly what he would have said if he was alive. Also, John is not doing anything unusual. The mikvah is part of Jewish culture, and it's not done to remove sins. It's done to remove ritual impurity. Okay, which could have got confused with doing the wrong thing, because if you don't do the removal of ritual impurity, that's considered a very big problem. So having a seminal emission is fine. Touching a dead body is fine. Menstruating is fine. They're all natural. Jews don't have a problem with it.
Right.
The problem is you can't go into the temple with those problems, because then the Shekinah will leave the temple, and then you're going to upset everybody, because God will disappear, and then everything will come to an end. So ritual purity is very important. So Yochanan and the mikvah, all right, why it was called John the Baptist is a later embroidery. But now we come to Origenus. And I've spoken about this before. I'm not going to bore you with why I know Origenus forged the John the Baptist section in Josephus, apart from the fact it appears in the same section as the mention of James, the brother of Jesus. In fact, the two are mentioned together by Origenus, put them in there for reasons which I won't go into right now. But Origenus, if you read his texts, he believed that baptism was a magical act. It was a sympathetic magical act. And the proof of that is Celsus says to him, well, he quotes Celsus, he says to him something like, I'm paraphrasing it, if you are going to become a Christian, you should do it through thinking, rationality, make a decision based on intellect. And the problem with you is that any idiot could come along and become a Christian and not really know what they're doing, and it's just too easy. Okay, so that's the paraphrase. So Origenus says, no, it doesn't matter if the person's an idiot, and Christians are not all idiots. It's the baptism that counts. And he keeps going on about how this baptism is so important, because it's got to be done in a particular way, and then you are one with Christ. And he says he has evidence that people change their personalities once they've been baptized. He actually says that. They suddenly, he's an ex-murderer, and the next minute he's a saint, just because he's had water dipped on his head. And I find that so amusing. And if you read the forgery in Josephus, the reason why he's saying that is because he wants somebody of authority to back him up from a previous era to say, this is why baptism is important.
Wow.
Josephus is nitpicking a theological point from the 3rd century in the 1st century.
That strikes me as odd, too. I've always wondered.
It's total bullshit. Total bullshit. And also the fort of Macarius. There is a mention of Macarius in that particular letter, in that particular text. Okay, it belonged to one of the Aretuses of Nabatea. And we know that the Herod that he's talking about couldn't go there because it belonged to his father-in-law, was at war with him. And then a little bit later in the text, this Herod sends John the Baptist to that castle to be a prisoner. That's impossible, because he didn't own the castle. It belonged to his father-in-law, and his father-in-law was at war with him at the time. It's obvious proof that it's a forgery. The forger put it in there because he wanted some place to imprison John. He wanted some place in the text to put in his little quip about what baptism does for you, the doctrinal nitpicking. And then he can point to it later, because I told you they made this stuff up. He would say, we know this is true because look, Josephus said it, you see, in the past. It's very obvious what's going on here.
Whoa.
Yeah.
Boy, oh boy.
Anyway, you've got the book now. You must read it.
Yes. Yeah. Oh, I got it right over there.
You are in the book, by the way.
Oh, I know this.
I want to look at more again at the Fortress Macaris thing because that is
Eusebius.
that's
Sorry,
pretty
Eusebius is the creator of the Testimonium.
That's what I think.
Yeah. Sorry, Jacob, I interrupted you.
Oh no, it's fine. It's fascinating. It really is. Let's see here. Let's have a couple more super chats. Stock Father, thank you for your super chat. I referred Tolstoy to Bob. Thoughts? I am D. Brian.
I think very highly of Tolstoy and the whole Grand Inquisitor. No, it's Dostoevsky. What am I thinking? I just got a copy of Tolstoy's version of the Gospels. I got to see what he had to say, but I've not yet read it. I know he tried to live out the whole Sermon on the Mount and wouldn't stop burglars and so on from stealing and blind and all that. Kind of an experiment. Could you really live that way? Was he also the author of the Death of Ivan Ilyich? I think he was, right? Tolstoy?
I don't know.
I don't know.
I think he was. That I found profound and amazing, but I'm sure I've not yet read what he's referring to. But I like what I have read.
Yeah, Doug, to finish what I was saying earlier about John the Baptist, I know some argue that John the Baptist died after Jesus, and I wonder if I used to wonder if that were the case, but I do think it makes sense that John was before, and that was actually a serious issue because Jesus would be praising John and admitting that his predecessor was somehow better than himself, because John the Baptist was greater than anyone else born of a woman. So John would be greater than Jesus, regardless if he's before or after Jesus. And so
the Pseudo-Clementines, that's one of the arguments the John the Baptist sect uses against the Christians, saying, look, if he said this, he must be including himself as inferior to John the Baptist, which I assume is an actual piece of theological polemic from back there. And it seems to me that that statement must have originated with the John the Baptist people. I mean, not Christians, and that Christians tried to counter it by adding that thing. Nonetheless, the lowest schlemiel on the totem pole in the kingdom of God is superior to John. Come on, that's got to be a Christian rejoinder to this praise of John the Baptist. It can't be authentic, even if there was a Jesus to have said it.
I just had another thought that if John was an historical person and he was indeed part of the Essene Yachad denomination, shall we call it, Herasis, he would have been a dualistic Jew, which is also very different because the Essenes were dualists. They believed in evil, the personification of evil. We know that from the war scrolls they took about at the end times, Satan coming with his troops and that fighting against the good people. Now that is not Judaism. I mean, normative Judaism doesn't believe in a personification of evil, but Christians do. Would it not be interesting if John took it further and actually believed that there was an evil entity that was affecting people, that it wasn't about free will anymore? They were somehow being contaminated, and maybe that's why he exaggerated the mikvah in a way that could be used as a means to remove this affliction. But just interesting, because I mean, it's obviously a side issue here, but that would be interesting because that would have positive impact on early Christianity because they would pick up on that. If you can see where I'm going there, you know.
Well, the Zoroastrian elements in post-exilic Judaism and the idea of Beliar in the Dead Sea Scrolls and all that, there is some kind of a moral metaphysical dualism. And
normative Judaism, post-exile Judaism and Zoroastrianism coexisted for at least 300 years. So there's a reason why those elements are coming in and why the Essenes came up with this dualist movement. And also the angels. I mean, we were originally told the angels were the original polytheistic deities that got recast as angels. I don't buy that. In Zoroastrianism, that is true, because a Yazata means an old god. And some of the Yazatas were good, and some became Devas, which means a demon. Okay, and they serve Angra Mainyu, and the Yazatas serve Ahura Mazda. And they have what's called the Spenta Mainyu, the 7 holiest of holies, around where one of them is Angra Mainyu. And they all have the same face, they all have the same bodies, they are emanations from the Holy One. And they all have different jobs. And then you go and read Enoch,
7
and you see that
archangels.
exactly the same setup with the archangels, you know, with Michael and Raphael and Uriel, 7 of them, each with a specific job to do. And you know, almost as an emanation of the angel of the Lord or the angel of God. So that's a direct copy. It's a crypt. You know? So there's a lot of that that came out of it. But there is definitely a golden thread in Judaism that doesn't owe anything to Zoroastrianism. And that golden thread goes way back to Canaanite times and the original Sinai metal god Yahoo. And he was a snake god, probably made out of copper. And he was a minor deity originally. That's why Moses has a snake on a pole. I mean, does that make sense? He's just criticized his brother for making a golden calf. And he says, no, that was bad, but here, I've got a nice copper snake. You can worship that. That's fine. Yeah.
Fascinating. Wow. You know, I'm really blessed here because I've got a cheap plaster statuette of Uriel over there and a nice metal statue of Metatron over there. So
Metatron, yeah.
Oh boy.
I see you collect superheroes, eh?
Oh yeah. I've been a lifelong fan of Superman, Spider-Man, and others, and you wouldn't believe how many of these things fill
the James Campbell collection. The James Campbell collection, eh?
James
Campbell collection.
You mean Joseph Campbell, or?
I mean, sorry, Joseph Campbell. Yes,
oh.
Joseph.
Yeah, the hero with that's right. In fact, there's a Doc Savage novel called The Thousand-Headed Man that I'm pretty sure was written before Campbell with the hero with 1,000 faces. I just love all of that stuff. And to me, it's like a seamless fabric. I'm heavily into H.P. Lovecraft and so forth as well. And to me, it all blends together in an astonishing way. And one sheds light on the other. And I just think there's a lot to be said by way of educating people. I think that this is a natural entree to a lot of people, including jailed criminals who are big comic book fans, even though they're in there because they're the villains. And kids, I once, my wife was teaching a first grade class, and she had me come in to speak about superheroes. Well, I've taught grad students, seminarians, undergraduates, but this was the first time I was ever in front of an audience of little kids. And I thought, oh boy, they may eat me alive here. But we're talking about superheroes, and I had an amazing revelation that these kids were all intelligent, and it was exactly like any of the other teaching experiences I had. It really didn't matter what age they were. And we had this in common, so I could talk with them about it. Fascinating. Oh, boy. Sorry about that. Let's get off on.
No, it's wonderful.
Crazy stuff, but Superman does dominate. There are various others. Oh boy.
Let me just take these last two super chats and we'll close. Solar at Night, thank you for your super chat. Ancient Judaism used mikvah, a ritual bath, to achieve spiritual purity. Pre-baptism cult of Baptist.
Well, we just spoke about that now.
The Mandeans, the Hamero Baptists, the Masbathians, there's loads of them that were big into baptism.
I can only repeat what we just said, and that is that the mikvah is used to cleanse ritual impurity. And anybody can use it. And it's normally done during major changes in your life, like after menstruation or seminal emissions, or maybe you just want to get right with God. There's no reason, there's no fixed agenda there. But what is different with John the Baptist is that one gets the hint that he's not just worrying about ritual impurity. He seems to think that people carry around something which is later going to be called original sin, and somehow you're going to remove it with this magic formula. But again, that could have been a later redaction. That's a problem. We don't really know what John thought. I think that John saw this simply as a mikvah, but maybe because he was in a scene, he did have a concept of a personification of evil. Perhaps. That's as far as I could go with it. I don't even want to add to that.
I must recommend a book to everybody listening and to my fellow panelists, if you're not familiar with it, which you probably are. Sam K. Williams, Jesus' Death as Saving Event. It's wrote in the 70s, I think. It's about how he zeroes in on a passage in Romans that he thinks is a pre-Pauline fragment, and it has to do with how the death of Jesus was first seen as a way of ritually purifying Gentile converts, because it was all right when they weren't part of the house of Israel. They weren't expected to keep the purity laws, but once they're joined to the biblical tradition, what are they going to do? They've never done atoning sacrifices. Well, God was willing to accept the martyr death of Jesus so that everyone who would join up and get baptized was now ritually pure. It's really fascinating.
That's a very interesting, very, very interesting point. I like that. I like that a lot.
It's amazing. And also it has interesting implications, because the idea is that these earliest Christians wouldn't have thought that fellow Jews who didn't believe in Jesus were damned or unbelievers. They were okay. It was just, what about, so when it says that Jesus came to save the nations, they didn't mean everybody, including the Jewish nation. They meant all the Gentiles. It's really eye-opening. It's one of my favorite books.
Robert, I must just tell you, I'm in contact with some modern Christians now, in the last 20 years, and they believe exactly that. They believe that because I'm a Jew, I don't need Jesus, but they do because they're not Jews. So they actually believe
why
that.
not?
Yeah. And the other thing that's interesting is that in all of these religions where there is a God who's been sacrificed so that they can then deal with death for the lesser mortals like us, notice that the means of the death have to be dramatic. Let's take Dionysus, torn apart as a bull, ripped apart into pieces. Osiris, chopped up into pieces and dropped all over Egypt and then reassembled as a mummy. The point is, you're not going to believe your God can save you if they didn't experience the worst kind of death. Because if Osiris had just had a head cold, nobody's going to buy that. Okay? And there's the same with Jesus. He's got to have a horrible public, humiliating death. Lots of blood, lots of whipping, lots of spears, and then the fact that he survives that and comes back as a resurrected being, whether spiritual or as a living corpse again, doesn't really matter. The point is, if you put your faith in him, you say, well, look what he went through, and he's alive. So when I die of a head cold, I'm fine. I'm definitely going to be safe. And it's important that the deity has that dramatic death. It has to be dramatic. You can go back in history; they all have terrible, terrible ends. That makes it worthwhile.
Hercules dies from a poisoned garment, and dies in torment. Purusha sacrifices himself to create all life forms and so on. The man
Orpheus is beheaded. Orpheus is beheaded. Yeah.
On and on. Boy. Sheesh.
We got one more super chat. And this will be the last super chat I'm taking, everybody. Dave Harden, thank you for your super chat. I ponder if Philo pleaded with Caesar to give the Jews time to accept the new Judaism, one which did not demand one be Jewish by birth, but rather reborn, inventing a proto-Paul to make that possible. What do y'all think about
that? What scenario are we envisioning with Philo and Caesar?
I have no idea.
I want to know which Caesar we're talking about.
Yeah, Dave is not specifying.
Title, right? There's a title for the emperor.
We will just move on from that.
Interesting.
Well,
what I can quickly say
yeah,
is that one of the reasons why during the end of the Republic and the beginning of the Empire, the Jews actually had a very good dispensation, mostly with the authorities in Rome. They were not subject to the same strict censures that the others were, for example, being forced to go into the army and stuff like that, because they claimed they were praying for the emperor in Jerusalem in the temple. And that softened things. So there is that. Of course, that didn't last very long. Domitian came along and things got bad. But in that earlier period, the Jews actually had quite a good ride. They had quite a nice time. I mean, there are exceptions. There was a brief time when Jews got chased out of, as we saw in the PowerPoint, when there was the expulsion of the Jews under Claudius. But that was only a local event. It didn't happen over the whole empire. And they didn't leave Rome in the sense that they disappeared. They probably lived in the suburbs or the outer areas. So it wasn't a total banishment. If that's worth anything here, yeah.
Well, I just got to say, I find this enormously fun and enlightening. As it says in Shakespeare, when shall we three meet again? I think we ought to make it a regular thing. Great stuff.
I just remind everybody real quick that Nicholas's book, The Jesus Fallacy, and Bob's book, The Amazing Colossal Apostle, are linked in the description below, and it will also be in the pinned comment. So if you want to purchase your copies, you can get them down in the description below and the pinned comment. That being said, Nicholas and Bob, thank you both very much for joining me today.
It's a pleasure, Jacob. Thank you.
Great. Yeah.
Hello viewers, thanks for watching this video from the History Valley YouTube channel. Please don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell. And if any of you wish to further support this channel, please consider checking out this channel's Patreon page and becoming a patron. And or donate through PayPal or through Super Chat during your live stream. Thank you.